I never thought that I would start all over again at the age of 30. 3 years ago, my life was perfect. Or at least that's what it seemed to me while David was around. He was everything I could have wanted. By day, he's a brilliant doctor. By night, he's a talented guitarist. And in between, he's the kindest soul I've ever met. We were together for 5 years, and I was sure that we would grow old side by side, laughing at wrinkles and arguing about which TV series to watch before going to bed. David loved his motorcycle. I often joke that he turns into a real weekend warrior, ripping off his doctor's coat and changing it for a leather jacket at the first opportunity. He laughed back and said it was the perfect combination of responsibility and freedom. That's exactly how he was, collected, disciplined, but at the same time light and free, like a melody that he hummed to himself when he was thinking about something of his own. That morning didn't bode well. It was the same as hundreds of previous ones. We had breakfast together, coffee, toasts, a few words about the plans for the day. He kissed me goodbye, grabbed my helmet and, with a wink, went for a short walk before his shift at the hospital. He never got to work. The car ran a red light. And just like that, in an instant, one movement, one blow, my world collapsed. The first months after the accident merged into one continuous, murky spot. I existed, but I didn't live. The days turned into nights, the nights into restless, nightmare-filled hours as I saw David slipping away from me into the darkness over and over again. The only salvation was work. I immersed myself in programming, took on any projects, just to keep my head busy and not think. My sister Sarah, despite her habit of lecturing and condemning, turned out to be my safe haven. She came, brought food, forced me to go outside at least for a few minutes. Sometimes she brought her sons, Mateo and Nestor. They were noisy, cheerful, full of life, and their energy somehow made my existence a little more bearable. So 3 years have passed. I didn't date anyone, I didn't go on dates, I didn't even allow myself to think about a new life. My job was my salvation, and time passed. I earned enough to help Sarah with the boys. After her divorce, money became an eternal headache for her. I lived in a kind of strange, suspended state, not in front, not behind, just in the void. And then last week, his former bandmates came. We used to get together sometimes, reminisce, laugh, and play old songs. That evening, Biagio, their vocalist, took out David's old guitar. "Music is a medicine for the soul," he said, running his fingers over the strings. I listened to these sounds and suddenly realized that I had to do something that would keep David in my life, but at the same time allow me to finally move on. I've never been a fan of tattoos. To be honest, I was quite conservative about all kinds of body modifications. But the idea that I could carry a piece of David with me seemed right to me. It wasn't just an image on my skin, it was a reminder that he was, that he is, that his influence on me has not disappeared. I signed up for a tattoo parlor. Contrary to my ideas, it turned out to be not at all a dark, dubious place with flashing neon signs. On the contrary, the salon looked more like an art studio. Clean white walls, soft light, the smell of fresh ink and disinfectant solution. An artist named Anna was carefully studying the photographs of David that I had brought. "It has to be a special image," I told her. She nodded. A few hours of sketching, discussions, clarifications, and finally, the moment has come. I watched as the needle moved across my skin, leaving fine lines behind, turning pain into art. The contours, the details, every shadow, everything was perfect. Eventually, it appeared on my hand. David. With a guitar slung over his shoulder. With the same smile he gave the world when he was playing. It was painful, but it was worth it. 2 weeks have passed. The tattoo has healed, it has become a part of me. And at that moment, when I looked at her in the mirror, I felt something strange. For the first time in many years, I had the feeling that I was living again. I decided it was time to visit Sarah and the boys. It was Saturday when I drove up to my sister's house. I was wearing a light jacket with long sleeves. I wasn't used to showing a tattoo yet. When I knocked, I heard footsteps inside. Mateo and Nestor were thundering down the stairs. The door swung open, and the next thing I knew, I was in a tight embrace. "Aunt Donata!" Mateo shouted. He's already 12, but he still hasn't lost his childish enthusiasm. I smiled, hugging him to me. Nestor followed him, a little more restrained, but no less joyful. Nestor, trying to maintain the unflappable demeanor of a 15-year-old teenager, stayed behind, but could not hide his smile. Sarah appeared behind him, looking genuinely happy to see me. "Great time," she said, smoothing a stray lock of hair. "I just made lunch." The house was warm and smelled of baked vegetables and spices. I took off my jacket without even thinking. I was wearing my favorite short-sleeve t-shirt. And suddenly the room was too quiet. The silence lasted only a few seconds before it was broken by Mateo's enthusiastic shout. "No, it's Uncle David." He rushed over to me, grabbed my wrist, and stared at the tattoo. "It's so cool. Look, Nestor, he's got his guitar and everything." Nestor, who usually tried to keep any emotions to himself, came closer, bent down and narrowed his eyes in study. He swallowed, clearly not wanting to show how impressed he was. "It's actually very cool, Donata. He looks like him." Before I could answer, Sarah's cold, harsh voice filled the air. "Donata, what were you thinking?" I raised my head and met her gaze. Her face was tense, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. "It's just ugly," she continued, shaking her head. "I can't believe you would do something so permanent without consulting anyone." I felt my face heat up. Anger, embarrassment, resentment, all mixed into one lump, pressing in my chest. "Sarah," I took a deep breath, trying not to snap. "I didn't want to consult with anyone. It's my body, and I decide what to do with it." Her gaze was so cold that it could freeze hell. But she didn't say anything. We sat down at the table. The boys kept asking questions about the tattoo, animatedly sharing their favorite memories of David, but I could feel Sarah radiating disapproval. Every time I caught her eye, she wasn't looking at me, but at my arm, as if the tattoo had offended her personally. I tried to lighten the mood by telling the boys about how David tried to teach me how to play the guitar. How patiently he showed me the chords, and then in the end he laughed and said that I'd better keep writing code, because I couldn't do anything with music anyway. Mateo and Nestor laughed. But Sarah was silently pushing the food around her plate. It was about 8 o'clock when my phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen. I immediately realized what was going to happen next. Sarah must have already texted her. As soon as I picked up the phone, I heard a voice filled with that special mix of disappointment and condemnation that my mother had been honing for years. "Your sister just told me what you did to yourself. I must say, Donata, that I absolutely disapprove of this." "What were you thinking?" I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, trying not to lose my composure. "Mom, I'm 30 years old. I don't need your approval for decisions about my own body." There was a familiar, irritated sound on the phone, the short, snorting sigh she always used to accompany her displeasure. And then silence. She just hung up. The following weeks after the tattoo show flew by in a fog of code and deadlines. I was doing a major project for a new client, and that meant endless hours in front of the computer. It was almost a relief to have an excuse not to visit Sarah and deal with her disapproval. But eventually the project reached a stable point, and I could no longer hide behind my work. As usual, I went to Sarah's on Saturday afternoon. As soon as she opened the door, I realized that something was wrong. Her face was set, her lips pressed together, Her eyes narrowed. I knew this expression all too well. It always appeared before a serious conversation began, which I absolutely did not want to have. Mateo and Nestor were in the living room, immersed in video games. When I entered, they jumped up to greet me, but Sarah stopped them. "Boys, go upstairs," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. They exchanged worried glances, the kind of expression children have when they sense something unpleasant is coming. The sound of the door closing reverberated through the suddenly silent house. "What's going on?" I asked, genuinely confused. Sarah crossed her arms over her chest and stared at me. "Do you know what Mateo asked me yesterday?" I shook my head. He wanted to know if he could get a tattoo when he turned 16. I tried to convince her that when they grow up, they will make their own choices about their bodies, just like I made my own choices. She said, "I don't want you to come to my house anymore. You're a bad influence on my boys." I left her house that day feeling like I was in some kind of weird dream, as a simple tattoo turned into this family-destroying drama. At home, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I was sitting in my apartment, staring at my phone screen, rereading my own messages that went unanswered. Mateo and Nestor have always been a part of my life. Their laughter, their endless questions, their childhood and now teenage joys and worries. They were more than just nephews. They were my family, and now they're gone. Did Sarah really forbid them to communicate with me? I clutched the phone in my hand, suppressing my anger. It was so ridiculous that I couldn't even wrap my head around it. It's like I've done something unforgivable, something that makes me dangerous to teenagers, even though the only thing that's changed is the image on my skin. I knew Sarah was stubborn. If she decides that I have become a bad influence, it will be difficult to convince her otherwise. But her personal opinion is one thing, and the other is that she's dragging Mateo and Nestor along with her, forcing them to make choices they don't want. In the end, I couldn't stand it. I dialed Nestor's number. The signal went off, and I froze, hoping that he would pick up the phone after all. But instead, the call was dropped. I immediately tried to call Mateo. Again, nothing. My heart sank. I couldn't just leave it like that. On Sunday morning, I got up earlier than usual, grabbed my car keys and drove towards Sarah's house. I didn't even think about what I was going to say. I just knew I had to see the boys. When I pulled up, I noticed that her car was parked in the driveway. So they were at home. I knocked on the door. 1, 2, 3. Silence. I knocked harder. A few seconds later, the door opened and Sarah stood in front of me. She looked like she was expecting me. "You shouldn't have come," she said, crossing her arms. I took a step forward. "I need to talk to the boys." Sarah shook her head. "They're busy." "With what?" I wasn't going to back down. "It doesn't matter, Donata. You don't seem to understand. I've made it clear that I don't want you here." I felt anger flare up, but I forced myself to speak evenly. "Sarah, this is ridiculous. Do you really think you can just cut me out of the boys' lives? They're not toys, they're people. They have their own feelings. Did you even ask them if they wanted to talk to me?" Sarah didn't answer. "They're not silent because they don't want to talk to me," I continued, staring intently into her eyes. "They are silent because you forbade them." Her face tightened, but she didn't say anything. "It's not fair," I added more gently. "They're bored." "I know it." Sarah frowned, but her lips twitched. "They need a stable environment, Donata. And you've changed. I'm not sure they should see this." I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly. "Sarah, I'm not a drug addict. I'm not a criminal. I didn't turn into someone else. I'm still the same." She looked away. "Do the boys know you're here?" At least let me talk to them. Let them decide for themselves. Sarah thought for a moment, but before answering, a voice came from behind her. Aunt Donata. I jerked my head up. Mateo was standing on the stairs, looking at me with concern. Nestor appeared behind him. Hi, baby, I smiled, feeling something shrink inside. Why didn't you call us? Mateo asked. I looked at Sarah. She averted her eyes. I called. I smiled, but there was bitterness in my voice. But it looks like I wasn't allowed to talk to you. Nestor frowned. We were told you were probably busy. I nodded, looking directly at Sarah. No, she wasn't. The boys exchanged glances. Mateo went down the stairs and came closer. Aunt Donata, he said softly, and if I want a tattoo when I grow up, will you come with me? I knelt down in front of him and gently touched his shoulder. Yes, if that's what you still want when you're an adult, I'll come with you. He smiled broadly, but immediately looked at his mother. But I don't want to, if you don't mind, Mom. I looked at Sarah. She was confused. Nestor nodded. Yes, Mom, it's just a drawing. It doesn't change a person. Sarah shook her head, but something in her face softened. It's just. I want you to make informed decisions, she murmured. We accept them anyway, Mateo said. Sarah didn't say anything, but after a moment she sighed heavily. Okay. But no tattoo until you're at least 18. The boys exchanged glances and nodded. I stood up and looked at Sarah. Thanks. She just nodded. I knew that we hadn't fully resolved this conflict yet. But it was a step forward. I looked at the boys again, and then I smiled. Now let's have some ice cream. Mateo and Nestor screamed with joy. And Sarah? She just shook her head, but a shadow of a smile appeared on her face. 2 months have passed. I threw myself into my work and took on additional projects to distract myself from the situation with Sarah and the boys. I wrote code, participated in endless meetings, loaded myself with tasks so as not to think about how a ridiculous dispute turned into a family disaster. But the closer Thanksgiving got, the harder it became to ignore what was happening. Normally, Mom would have called 2 weeks ago to discuss the menu, seating arrangements, who would bring the pumpkin pie, and who would take care of the baked turkey. But this year it's quiet. She probably just forgot, I told myself, even though I knew it was a lie. Mom never forgot to invite me to Thanksgiving. Never in my entire adult life. Everyone was busy, everyone had their own worries. But I did what I always did, I prepared the gifts. Mateo is a brand new game console that he's been dreaming about for over a year. Nestor needs expensive art supplies for his portfolio. For Sarah, it's a trendy coffee maker, which she dreamed of so much, but didn't dare to buy. I even chose gifts for my parents, a new book about World War II for Dad, and a silk scarf in her favorite color for Mom. After loading up the car, I tried to keep a positive attitude. They couldn't let something as trivial as a tattoo ruin Thanksgiving. It was our most important holiday. It was the only time of the year when the whole family gathered together, no matter what. Even 3 years ago, when I could barely function after David's death, I still came to dinner. I drove up to my parents' house. The trunk was full of carefully wrapped gifts. Familiar Thanksgiving decorations, ceramic turkey on the table, wreaths of autumn leaves, pumpkins on the porch. Everything looked the same as always. I smiled. But that smile immediately faded when I opened the front door. The scene I entered immediately seemed wrong. Everyone was there, Mom, Dad, Sarah, the boys. But instead of the usual warm chaos, the smell of spices, laughter, fuss, tension hung in the air. They looked at me like I was a ghost who had just materialized in their living room. Mom's voice was harsh. What are you doing here? I blinked, not immediately understanding what she had just said. What? I clutched the gift bags in my hands. It's Thanksgiving Day. I brought it. We didn't invite you, Mom said slowly, as if she were talking to a child. I felt something tighten inside me. We thought you'd understand what that means, she added. You shouldn't have come. The gifts suddenly seemed too heavy for me. I forced myself to speak calmly. I understand. I understand that I was not invited. Sarah stepped forward, crossing her arms. It was only then that I noticed that the boys weren't looking at me. Their eyes were fixed on the floor, their shoulders hunched. Because we don't need you showing off your tattoo and filling my kids' heads with even more inappropriate ideas about acceptable behavior, Sarah said. I put the bags on the table a little too hard. Are you kidding? Are we still fixated on this? Months have passed. It's just a tattoo. Just a tattoo. Sarah's voice rose an octave. It's a symbol of rebellion and disrespect. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to control my anger. Do you hear yourself? Uncle Ruggiero has tattoos all over his sleeve. Alice's cousin stuffed a phoenix on her back last month. No one said anything. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Mom intervened immediately. This is different. Other? You should have consulted with us first. You know how we feel about these things. I could feel the blood rushing to my face. To consult? I'm 30 years old. Why should I consult with someone about what to do with my body? Because we are your family. Sarah shouted. Because we have values. Because actions have consequences. I took a step back, looking at her in disbelief. The consequences? I repeated slowly. Are you really saying that my punishment for getting a tattoo is expulsion from my family? My mother said wearily. How should I feel? I looked around at them all, looking for at least a shadow of doubt, a shadow of support in someone's eyes. But all I found were hard looks and tight lips. The boys were silent. I took another step back, feeling something shrink inside. Okay, I said softly. If it's easier for you. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the exit. Donata, Dad's voice rang out, but Mom immediately pulled his sleeve, and he fell silent. I stopped at the door. Do you know what the irony is? I smiled bitterly. You all talk about values, about family, about consequences. But David would never do that to me. Silence. Happy Thanksgiving, I said, walking out the door. As soon as I was outside in the cold autumn air, my chest was squeezed so hard that I couldn't breathe. I got into the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I wasn't going to cry. But tears treacherously flowed down her cheeks. The only consequences here are the ones you create. I felt tears of disappointment rising in my throat, but I held them back. This tattoo means something to me. This is for David. It's my way of keeping him by my side, honoring his memory. That's when Sarah said it. Words that will change everything. Oh, don't start that again, she rolled her eyes. I've never liked him anyway. He was always showing off with his stupid guitar, acting like a rock star, riding that death trap motorcycle. She let out a short, sharp laugh. You know what? I'm glad he was hit by that car. Maybe now you'll finally grow up and start acting like a normal person. The room spun. I could barely breathe, but I managed to find my voice. Apologize, I demanded. My words sounded like a whisper at first, but they were gaining strength by the second. Apologize right now for what you just said about David. Sarah lifted her chin defiantly. I will not apologize for the truth. She turned to her parents. Mom, Dad, I want her to leave. She's ruining Thanksgiving. I looked at my parents, waiting for them to say something in my defense. That Sarah would be scolded for her cruel words about David. But instead, Mom stood up, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "Donata, I think it's time for you to go," she said softly. I stared at them all. The father avoided eye contact. Her mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Sarah stood there with a triumphant smile. And the boys, my boys, were looking at the floor, not saying a word. Without a word, I gathered up all the gifts I had brought and went out. The road to the local homeless shelter was blurred. I barely remembered handing gifts to the surprised volunteer at the door. "Everything's new," I explained automatically. "Game console, art supplies, coffee maker." I just couldn't leave them in the car. It was dark at home. I was sitting in the living room, staring into the void. Thoughts were spinning in my head. The monthly utility bills I've been making for Sarah since her divorce. The Christmas tradition that we started was a trip to Hawaii last year. Mateo's excitement when he saw the ocean for the first time. Endless sunset photos taken by Nestor. Sarah looked happy for the first time in a long time. I've already booked a trip to Europe this Christmas, planning to surprise them. But it wasn't just about the trips. I was thinking about regular trips to get school uniforms for boys. About the extra tutoring I paid for when Nestor was struggling with math. About the summer camp. About the monthly utility bills that were somehow miraculously paid, even when Sarah was out of work. About college funds. 2 years of careful savings so that my nephews would have a choice when they graduate from high school. I was thinking about David. What would he say if he could see it all? He probably would have joked about karma. And then he would get serious and remind me that love shouldn't be a one-way street. I opened my laptop. A strange calm spread through my body as my fingers ran over the keyboard. "I won't pay for your utilities anymore, since you think I'm such a negative influence. I'm sure you won't want to rely on my money. I will also no longer save money for boys' college. You've always said that you're their mother, and it's your responsibility, now it's all yours. I'm canceling all the trips I planned. Everything I've done for you and the boys, I've done from the bottom of my heart, out of love. But love is not a one-way street. And if I'm such a stranger in your life that I wasn't even invited to a family dinner, then I have nothing to do there." Asterisk. I reread the letter, feeling my breathing become easier with each word. I hesitated for a second, but then I clicked send. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. At some point, it turned into an endurance game. Who will give up first? Are they, with their persistent attempts to make me feel guilty, or am I, tired but unbroken, finally realizing that I have nothing more to prove? Their pressure was getting stronger every day. My phone was vibrating all the time, calls, messages, voice recordings. Some were short and demanding, "Call me back immediately." Others sounded like last-ditch attempts to appeal to feelings. "You don't want the boys to have the worst Christmas of their lives, do you?" I knew they thought I was just being stubborn, that I had to obey, that it was only a matter of time. They thought that if I found myself alone on a festive night, would immediately change my mind and come running to them with apologies. But I wasn't going to give up. At some point, I turned off notifications, but that didn't stop them. On the 5th day, my father came to my house. He didn't ring the bell in advance, just knocked on the door. I looked at him through the peephole. He stood there, punched under the weight of not so much age as the strain of recent weeks. I hesitated. Did I want to open the door? Then I realized he knew I was here. I sighed, stepped back, and turned the knob. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't make out, a mixture of exhaustion, regret, but no remorse. "Donata," his voice was quiet, even. "Do you really want to bring it to this point?" I crossed my arms over my chest. You want to bring it to this state? He grimaced. I'm not saying that Sarah was right, but you know how important it is to keep the peace in the family. I snorted. The world? Yeah, of course. Because you think I ruined it, right? Not Sarah, who said she didn't care that David was dead. Wasn't it you and Mom who decided that I wasn't worthy of attending a family dinner? No, it's all my fault. He sighed. I just want us all to make up. On your terms? I asked. So that I can come and pretend that nothing happened? So that I can accept that I can be cut out of my life and then pretend like it's okay? You're complicating the situation, Donata. No, Dad, I'm just defending myself for the first time in a long time. He looked at me for a long time, then looked away. If you don't come for Christmas, it will crush your mother. No, it would crush her idea that a family should always obey her rules, I corrected. There is a difference. He didn't know what to say. I could see that he wanted to add something else, but in the end he just nodded. Well, then. You know where we'll be. And he left. I closed the door and exhaled. I spent Christmas evening in a quiet, warm restaurant, at a table by the window, with a cup of hot mulled wine and a book that I had wanted to read for a long time. The loneliness they so terrified turned out to be not so terrible at all. I didn't miss the noise of their condemnation, the oppressive silence, the constant feeling that I needed to justify myself for who I am. I only missed the boys. I left my phone on that night. But neither Mateo nor Nestor wrote. However, I wasn't surprised. Another month has passed. Life went on. I worked, played sports, and celebrated the new year with friends. I was slowly getting used to my new reality, a reality in which my family was something distant, almost abstract. And yet, when I saw an incoming message from an unknown number, my heart sank. Aunt Donata. This is Mateo. I stared at the screen, feeling something turn over inside. I know that Mom forbade us to write, but I don't care. I miss you. I pressed the phone to my chest, took a deep breath, and exhaled. A few months passed, and life went on as usual. Sarah didn't show up at my house anymore, didn't text or call. I heard from distant relatives that she continued to complain about me, but her complaints were losing their force. The money she took for granted was no longer coming. She had to find other ways to deal with reality, and even though I knew it wasn't easy for the boys, I also knew it was her choice. I continued to see Dr. Martinez, and over time, our sessions began to bring the awareness I needed. For the first time in my life, I didn't just exist, I lived. And yet, one evening in March, when my phone lit up with a familiar number again, my heart sank. Mateo. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, and then pressed the call button. Aunt Donata. Hi, baby, my voice sounded steady, but my chest was turning over. How are you? I'm fine, there's a pause. Much better than Mom says. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Does she make you think I've left you? Yes. His voice was low. But I know that's not true. I closed my eyes, feeling something warm and painful spreading inside. I miss you, he confessed. I swallowed. I miss you too, Mateo. Can I ask you a question? Of course. Will you ever forgive Mom? I opened my eyes and looked at my tattoo. David would have smiled at me now, I was sure of it. I don't hold it against her, I finally replied. But forgiving doesn't mean letting people hurt you again. I just want everything to be the same, he murmured. I know, baby, I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. But sometimes, in order for something to get better, it must first change. He was silent for a long time, and then suddenly said, I want to see you. My heart sank. Are you sure? Yes. I nodded, even though I knew he couldn't see it. Good. Let's meet. We met at a cafe on the corner, where we used to often sit after school, where I bought them ice cream, where we chatted about everything in the world. Mateo has grown up. I've seen him grow taller in recent months, his face more serious, his voice a little lower. But when he hugged me, tightly, with force, it suddenly seemed to me that nothing had changed. I'm so glad to see you, he murmured. Me too, I smiled. We ordered hot chocolate. We talked about school, about his friends, and how he had become interested in photography. But at some point he looked down and asked, "Do you really not want to talk to us anymore?" "Mateo," I put my hand over his, "it's not like that. But your mom gave me a choice. And that choice was simple, either I do what she wants, or I'm not in your life." He nodded. "She can be too much sometimes." I chuckled. "Sometimes?" He chuckled back. "Okay, often." We finished our chocolate, and as we were leaving, he suddenly stopped. "I know that Nestor wants to see you too." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Then tell him that I'll always be there for him." He nodded, smiled, and then suddenly, very quietly, asked, "Antonata, are you happy?" I looked up at the sky, inhaled the spring air, and then turned my gaze to him. "I think so, Mateo. For the first time in a long time, yes." And he smiled. Just like David used to smile. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.